Why did Gordon Brown survive?
Because the coup was dead on arrival. There was a lot of fantasy reporting by people who didn't really understand the Labour Party rule book and just had a few whinging New Labour contacts. It was a coup, it was a Blairite coup start to finish. There were some non-Blairites, but it came from that wing of the party. And the centre and the left would have nothing to do with it. And you always have to remember the dog that didn't bark. The Labour Party now is dependent on the trade unions for funding. Most of the other funding has fallen away. If they had said to Gordon, you know, we're not throwing good money after bad, it would all have been over. But once he had the trade unions in the centre and the left, he was secure. And also the Labour Party is a very sentimental party. We don't do to our leaders what the Tories will do.
All the Lib Dems.
All the Lib Dems, yeah.
How crucial was Peter Mandelson to Mr Brown's survival?
I think he got to read the script, as it were, but I think fundamentally they kept Gordon Brown because they thought if they changed leader, they would have a snap election. And in a snap election, they would do very, very badly. And they hoped that an election in April of next year, something by then may have turned up so that fewer of them will lose their seats than otherwise would have done. And, you know, I'm delighted to hear Diane talking about factions because, you know, if that's the mentality the Labour Party's in, you will probably end up losing as many seats as you would have done if you'd had a snap election.
It's very hard to have a palace coup if you haven't got an heir apparent.
I said it last week. You cannot have a leadership challenge with no candidate and no alternative agenda. It was a rubbish coup from the beginning. But on the question of Peter Mandelson, I hate to give him credit unnecessarily, but I have to tell you, everybody says that Peter Mandelson is now running government. He is the ringmaster.
He's the de facto Prime Minister.
He is, yeah.
Yeah, but I see all that, but you are also on the same page as I am because you say that fundamentally the Parliamentary Labour Party, the trade unions, no one else involved was going to make the change last week. So even if Peter Mandelson didn't exist, I mean, on your thesis, I think the Labour Party wouldn't have made the change last week.
The argument is, I didn't listen on the phone calls, but the argument is that there was meant to be a plot. Hazel Bliss, for her own reasons, kind of went prematurely. But Purnell was meant to be followed by David Miliband, and that Mandelson was the person who dissuaded him from that. I don't know if it's true. I didn't hear the phone call.
I mean, it died while we were on air last week, actually. You gave the news on air last week that David Miliband had declared for the Prime Minister. That turned out to be real, you know, not just a gesture. There was the possibility...
Unlike Caroline Flint, who declared for the Prime Minister and changed her mind in 8 hours. Sorry, darling.
Highly principled decision.
Despite all the things you say about the trade unions, about the backbench and so on, it would have been possible, it is always possible, for a cabinet to lead a coup.
We have a different system. We have an electoral college.
No,
the cabinet didn't lead the coup.
No, they
that
didn't
was the
lead.
problem.
They didn't lead.
Cabinet
they were
led a
gutless.
coup against Margaret Thatcher. It didn't lead a coup against Gordon Brown.
Remember, the trigger with Margaret Thatcher was that she had not won an election against Michael Heseltine. But whatever the system may be, if a cabinet lines up to a Prime Minister and says, we're not serving you,
but they were never going to stand up.
They didn't do that.
They were never going to stand up.
Let's step back from the sort of the plotting of this, if that's what it was. And I want you to think about this. Labour got 15% of the vote. It hasn't had 15% of the vote since the First World War, when it was the third party. Now, contemplate that.
Yeah, but you also have to remember the Tories are not getting the consistent polling numbers that they would need, which is 40% and over, in order to win outright.
Well, no, the 40%'s a myth. What really matters is the gap between Labour and Conservative. This 40%'s a polling myth.
The 40% is based on Labour polling above 30%.
But whereas if Labour's down at 22, 23, the Tories don't have to be at 40.
No.
It's a 15-point gap gives an overall Tory
I mean, worse than that, the Tories were polling in the local elections 2-1. For each vote that Labour got, the Tories were getting 2 votes. Now, that's serious.
The Parliamentary Labour Party...
But can you really shove off the 15% just like saying, oh, well, the Tories aren't doing as well as maybe they should? 15% is an amazing figure, Diane.
It is, but, you know, you get these results in Euro elections. And nobody... Well, not enough people in the Parliamentary Labour Party were persuaded that by moving their leader like this, we would actually do better in the polls. You'd get a bump from Alan Johnson or David Miliband or whatever, but in the long run, our problems are systemic.
I think, paradoxically, the result was so bad that you didn't change leader, because what you saw was, if you were going to go to the polls within 2 months, 3 months of scoring 15%, Labour was going to be annihilated.
Let's talk about the relaunch of Mr. Brown. His own relaunch, his self-propelled relaunch. Just remind me, which number of relaunch is this? I forget. What would you say? Double figures yet? Anyway, tell us about this renewed or even new enthusiasm for electoral reform.
Oh, dearie me. Like I said, he gave this speech and said, I'm going to train, I'm going to listen. And, within 48 hours, we had this announcement, we're going to look at a new form of PR, which, of course, he'd not consulted the Parliamentary Labour Party about at all, because we wouldn't support it.
Do you think that's right, that you couldn't get a majority on the Parliamentary Labour Party for a form of PR?
No, you couldn't. No. You couldn't.
Then it won't happen.
Well, no, it won't.
Because the Tories are against it too.
You bet.
As Mr. Cameron said. How weak is Gordon Brown then, relaunch or no relaunch, Michael?
Well, I think he's pretty weak. I mean, you can imagine the Tories are now going to be able to use quotes on the record from people who were in his cabinet, who were in his
Yeah, you mean Caroline
government.
Flint?
No, I didn't mean Caroline Flint. I meant people who were in the cabinet, actually. Caroline Flint wasn't in the cabinet. People have left the cabinet saying very disobliging things about Gordon Brown. And the fact that so many women have left seems to revolve around the bullying culture. So I think the bullying culture... Oh, no.
No, mature politicians should not complain about bullying. You cannot be bullied unless
We're going to be talking about bullying in a
All right,
minute.
sorry,
let me move on then, because things... if you were Gordon Brown this week, you would think, I survived the leadership.
Yep.
Even independent institutes are talking about maybe the worst of the recession is over. Maybe there are some green shoots, though. As Prime Minister, I won't use that phrase, but... it could be better in a year's time.
Yeah.
And thirdly, I'm now talking about public spending. I can talk about Tory cuts and Labour spending. Do the politics of that still play?
It strikes me that when people get their wage packets at the end of April 2010, they're going to be paying a great deal more tax. And it strikes me that in April 2010, there are going to be a lot more unemployed people than there are today. It doesn't really matter, whether the economy turns the bottom of the curve or not, because next year people are going to be much worse off than they are this year. They're going through a kind of phony recession at the moment. Interest rates are low, they're paying less on their mortgages, most people are still in work. Next year is going to hit them very, very hard. In fact, I think the election's got to be before the end of April, because otherwise people are going to see how much extra tax they're paying.
Let me tell you something interesting that happened, because at PMQ's Gordon Brown tried to do the usual juxtaposition between Labour spending, Tory cuts. Then the bloggers got all over the figures. The bloggers got all over them and discovered that under Labour there will have to be cuts too, according to the Budget Red Book. Actually, almost exactly the same as what the Tories are proposing. By it this morning, not one paper on the left or the right had fallen for the Gordon Brown formula.